Hi, everyone. It is great to see you here. My name's Dave Nebinger. I've been doing Liferay for 10 years. I've been on the forums for most of that time. I've tried to help many of you out as much as I can. If I've spoken with you over the last day or 2 days, great. I really enjoyed talking with you and hope to talk to you more. If I haven't had a chance to speak to you yet, please approach me because, hey, I'm here to help you guys out. So today we're going to be, briefly, because of the time slot, talking about development pitfalls. So many of you might know this guy. This guy is from a game in the late 80s on the Atari 2600. His name is Pitfall Harry. And Pitfall Harry, his job is to run through the jungle, avoiding critters, pitfalls, traps, in order to collect all of the prizes. And basically as developers for Liferay 7, for Liferay DXP, for OSGi, we're kind of like Pitfall Harry. We're on a journey through the OSGi development, and our goal is to deliver some good software artifacts. But what you may not be aware of is there are some pitfalls ahead. And what I'm hoping to present here today is some of the pitfalls that I have encountered that I'm 100% sure you are going to encounter on your own, and hopefully provide you some tools and techniques to either avoid them or work around them. So first, you have your pitfalls that can come with your upgrade. Now, your upgrade for your plugins, you want to treat that as a project all on its own. And that your development team, developers, maybe yourself, you're going to want to say, oh, I'm going to go all in on OSGi. I'm going to rewrite all of my stuff and make them modules so that I can be 100% ready to go. But to me, that's kind of scope creep, because you want to manage your project, which the ultimate goal is to complete your upgrade. So don't get sidetracked with trying to do everything OSGi. Leave them as portlet wars. They are going to work. Use the upgrade assistant tool that Greg and the IDE team have put together, because it will be a great help towards getting your plugins updated for Liferay 7 and DXP. A note here about the portal dependency jars. That is deprecated. So you have to include all of your dependencies in the webinf lib of your plugin wars. With a caveat there. The ones you want to exclude are any jars that are also OSGi modules that you are going to be deploying into the OSGi container. Those you want to exclude from webinf lib. You need it for the build, you need it for the compile, but it should not be included. Lastly, you can use OSGi annotations, components, reference injection in your portlet wars. The problem is that is not supported. So while most of the time I've found that it works, if you run into any issues, you're kind of on your own. So I would suggest avoiding them at all if you can. So with Service Builder, you can use your Service Builder portlet war services in OSGi modules. Likewise, if you have Service Builder service modules, you can use those services in your portlet wars. I have a blog, and you guys will get all these slides, so the links will be available for you. But I went through all of the different ways that you approach your Service Builder updates. And there's sample code, everything's out there, so you can look at it when you can. My suggestion is to move those guys to OSGi modules, because you will be using those services going forward in your ongoing development. And having them as OSGi will just make things easier for you. So you might be thinking, oh, portlet wars, they still work. I don't want to learn this OSGi stuff. I can use my current build tools and create portlet wars and just deploy those. I don't know if it's official or if this is just my impression, but the portlet wars are kind of either deprecated or they're on their way to being deprecated. So I would say for all of your new development, you should be using modules, OSGi modules, and avoid the portlet wars. Some of you doing Spring MVC or JSF, you have to stay with portlet wars, and I would suggest you stay with them until Liferay comes up with a migration path that will help you get those out of wars and into modules. So we've completed our upgrade. Now we're doing new development. What kind of pitfalls are we going to run into here? So OSGi. OSGi rewards good design. It rewards you if you use design patterns. It rewards you if you structure your code in good ways. For those of you that may be new or afraid of OSGi, conceptually it's a lot like Spring. You have your design by interface because you want to separate your interface from your implementations. You have your inversion of control based on dependency injection using the @reference notation. You also have annotation-based inline configuration of your components. Excuse me. So a lot of the Spring sort of concepts, while implemented differently and used a little differently, the concepts are still the same. So with your declarative services, you're going to want to take advantage of these for the most part to create and inject services of your own design. A lot of this is going to be because you want to manage the dependencies, and we're going to get to dependencies because that's very important for most of us. But you need to structure your code so that you can isolate your dependencies and prevent them from bleeding through the entire system. When in OSGi, that's a play on when in Rome, do as Romans do. So when you're in OSGi doing module development, you don't want to use any of the static util classes. Those are all bad. You want to use your @reference injection. Don't use portal util anymore. Inject the portal into your service and leverage it that way. The static util classes have a lot of issues when you are developing OSGi native components. You have to be worried about checking for nulls because the actual service might not be available. So there's a lot of extra development stuff you have to do to leverage it. It's great if you're doing classic development because it fits well into code that you already have. But for your new stuff, go with the reference injection. Dependency resolution. This has been the bane of my existence, and I'm sure it has been the bane of many of your existence as well. The questions I often get is, why isn't the OSGi container injecting the references for me? Why am I getting these unresolved references? Why can't it just go out to a remote repository and pull what it needs so that it can run? The problem is we as developers are spoiled by Maven, by Gradle, by Ivy, because all we have to do is say, oh, I have a dependency on Spring transaction, and it's going to pull that in, but it's also going to look at the whole network of transitive dependencies and pull those in as well so that the compile can complete successfully. The problem with OSGi, from a developer perspective, is that it is not going to do that, but it's not designed to. The OSGi container is your runtime container. It is your production environment. You want it to be secure. You want it to be stable. You want it to be a known entity so that there are no ambiguities in there. And for that reason, it does not judge. It doesn't say, oh, I should go out and pull something in, because that is an attack vector that some hacker could inject themselves in and feed you your OSGi container something that it shouldn't have. So there's many reasons why the OSGi container doesn't go out and fetch stuff for you. Now, that of course makes our job a lot easier or harder as developers, because we now have to account for all of this. There's basic steps that you go through for processing that, but it's once you start doing it a few times, you'll figure out the keys for being effective at it. What you want to avoid doing is getting frustrated with it. Everybody runs into these issues, especially with POI. I see a lot of forum posts about how do I use POI in my modules. It is doable. So don't be frustrated by it. Come to the forums, ask for some help, and you'll get some help out there. So I also mentioned that you want to isolate your dependencies. I worked with a client who was using Jackson for Java marshalling. And they went through the process of creating an implementation module. They had an API module with their POJOs in it. But what they had done is they used the Jackson annotations in their API module. And what they were seeing was every consumer of that marshalling layer, every consumer of that API jar had to have Jackson as a dependency. So they were having issues with, all of my modules now need Jackson. So I need to make that global. Well, no, that was really the wrong approach, because from a container perspective, you can't control whether everyone is going to use the same version of Jackson that your one API needs. So you want to isolate those dependencies. We took Jackson and we took out the annotations, we built it all into the implementation, and that way the consumers could use the API interface, did not get any of the dependencies on Jackson, had no idea that Jackson was even being used for the marshalling, and we isolated it into the implementation jar. So you want to focus on how you can isolate and encapsulate those dependencies so you don't suffer from the bleed throughout your system. If you see yourself wanting to make a jar global so that everyone has access to it, that's kind of a sign that there's probably some things you can do there to re-architect to remove that as a dependency and make things work a little better for you. Another example, I had a project where I was doing XML parsing, but I didn't know, did the client have a preference on Commons Digester or Extreme? So I created an API module that had my interfaces that represented parsing of XML. I had my interfaces representing the objects that I was going to be reading and returning, but that's all that I had in my API. Then I created two implementation modules. One used Commons Digester. The other one used Extreme. The dependencies and transitive dependencies were isolated to the implementation jar. The client was free to say, oh, I don't like Commons Digester because I avoid all the Apache guys. Okay, just pull that out. The Extreme one is in there. Everyone can use it. No change to the environment, no change to runtime, no change to consumers. You just deploy it and it's off and running. So that's the kind of direction that you want to go in. For versioning, we often want to say, I want to use the latest version of code because then I know I'm getting all the bug fixes, I'm getting all the improvements that have gone in. When you're picking dependencies for your modules, you kind of want to think the reverse. I want to pick the oldest version that I can get away with. So when I'm going for Portal kernel, I want to stick with 2.0.0. I don't want to use 2.42 if that's what's in my local environment. The problem is when you deploy that, OSGi will happily handle that in an environment where that version is available. So somebody running the latest version of the portal. But if somebody is a few fix packs behind, You're a developer. You're running GA1 because you don't really need to update all those versions. That module that uses the later version of Portal kernel is not going to run in that environment because it's out of date. It's too old. So you want to pick the earliest version that works for you. The flip side of that is I was building a project that was based off of System Setting Locator, which is a configuration admin utility class that we have. But that was released in Fixpack 23 or Portal kernel 2.37.0. So I'm faced with a choice. I can either stick with that, declare my dependency as 2.37.0, and use that code and deploy it, and it's going to work. But the caveat there is it's not going to run in a lower environment. So I changed my code, took out that dependency, reworked it, and stuck with 2.0.0. That way I could release my code and it would run anywhere. Now, whatever happens, you're going to fall into the pit. I fall into the pits all the time, and I've been doing this for 2 years. It happens. How do you recover from that? The first is your unresolved references. This goes back to the dependencies and the bane of our existence. You're going to use the go commands, LB for listing the beans, SCR diag, SCR info to find out details about services. You're going to use the WTF, DTM WTF to find what's going on in your environment. And then you're going to go back and address your missing dependencies or ones that you want to exclude. Wash, rinse, repeat until you get a good deployed module. Note that OSGi does not treat optional jars as optional. Everything that is declared optional from a Maven or Gradle perspective is treated as required within OSGi. Because Jackson, for example, will mark Joda time as optional, as an optional dependency, because it doesn't have to have Joda to run, but if you're doing something with date marshaling, it's a good utility to have in there. So Jackson will mark that as optional. But OSGi has no idea. Are you going to be doing some date parsing? Are you not? So it sees that optional dependency. It's going to say, hey, it's unresolved. You have to satisfy it. So only you as the developer are going to know, all of my stuff that I'm marshaling, I don't have any date stuff, so I'm going to exclude it. Or I know I'm going to be working with data that has dates in it. I want to include it so that I make sure it gets processed. The other trap that you're going to fall into is the module is active, but it's not doing anything. And you can actually force this to happen yourself. If you have a service builder API jar, an implementation jar, and a web jar where you have added some at reference for the API. You can deploy the API. It's going to start, it's going to show up as active in GoGo. That's great. You can deploy the web without doing the impl jar. And when you look, GoGo is going to resolve it. It's going to show that it's started and active. But if you go and try to place the portal on the page, it's not going to be there. So like, what the heck? I mean, you've deployed it, but it's not available. The problem is there are unresolved or unsatisfied references. So the issue is that the reference that has to be injected is not available. So OSGi is not going to actually start your components. So again, you're going to use the SCR list, SCR info, and the DM WTF to find out where those things are. I also understand we're coming out with some additional tooling for GoGo to provide an unsatisfied command that's going to help identify these guys so you can find them quicker. You can also get into a situation where you have introduced a loop between your dependencies. So you have module foo that has an at reference requirement on module bar. And you have module bar that has an at reference dependency on foo. Well, OSGi is not going to start either one because they have required mandatory references that are just not satisfiable. So you get around this by using the reference policy of optional on one side. That means that your use of foo in bar is optional. You would like to have it, but it's not mandatory in order to start. That way bar will start. And since bar is now available, foo will get the injection. It can start. And once it starts, then bar will be injected with foo. The issue you have to worry about there is you have to do null checks on the bar side to make sure you actually have a foo, because you might not have had it injected yet. Maybe somebody didn't deploy it or undeployed it, or it has a reference on something else that isn't available. So you have to watch out for those. Class cast exceptions are still going to happen. We thought, I'm no longer in Liferay 6. I no longer have the class loader issues. It's not going to be a problem. Well, you can still have that problem in OSGi. If you include a jar as a dependency inside of your module that is also provided somewhere else in another OSGi module, then your class loader will have multiple copies of the class, and you can run into class cast exceptions for something that should match up but can't because of the class loader. So you need to watch out for that. If you have a service available or a class available, you want to check to make sure that you're not also including it in your own module. There's other oddities that I've run into. I change the meta information for an at component or an at reference, and I deploy it, but I don't see any change in the environment. So what's going on here? Honestly, I don't know. I know I can go in and I can purge the OSGi state directory. I can restart the container. And when it comes up, it's going to have all the new information in there and things just work. If you can find a reproducible situation where we can show how that is happening, please open a ticket on it, because that's something that I feel like we need to resolve. I had a friend who said, hey, I have this at reference injection on my class, and I'm always getting null pointer exceptions on it. What's going on? Help me figure this out. And he had the at reference injection. The reference service was available, was started, but it was not getting injected. The problem was his class was not itself a component. So your at reference injection is only going to happen for your component classes. So you can solve this by either marking the class as a component or use a service tracker in order to get access to the service when it becomes available. The important part is the at reference is only going to work for component classes themselves. Some additional recommendations of things that I've found. Use a good bundle and symbolic name. For example, if I were fortunate enough to be working on foo and foo and bar modules for MIT, I want to give my bundles names like MIT Foo API, MIT Foo Impl, MIT Foo Web, and then repeat for the bar modules. Because when I go into GoGo, I want to be able to do LB and grep for MIT in order to find all of the custom modules that I have created for that client. And it's going to exclude all the Liferay ones. Or I want to be able to do LB and grep for foo because I want to see just the foo modules. So using good naming here is going to be very important. Make sure that you pick names that are not going to possibly conflict. If you're calling your stuff Liferay blah, 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 that's probably going to be a bad idea because you're going to conflict with Liferay modules that may exist or may come out in the future. Don't let Liferay derive your portlet name. In your portlet, in the component annotation for properties, the JavaX portlet name property is optional. If you provide it, it will use it. If you do not provide it, Liferay will happily generate one for you based on an algorithm that they have created. The problem is they might change that algorithm. And that actually happened to me. I went from using periods to underscores. They changed the algorithm, but it did not update the database. So all of a sudden I had references on pages for portlets that didn't exist because the names were not syncing up. So I learned that you want to actually declare your own names. That way you're not relying on Liferay's algorithm and the fact that they might change it in the future. Short names are going to be best to have shorter URLs. For your package exports, follow the same kind of decision making you're going to do for your private, protected, and public method and members in your classes. It's the same sort of concept. Do I export something? Well, only if someone's going to extend it or consume it. If not, then keep it as private. And the last one is an important one. Do not export the same package in multiple bundles. OSGi does not distinguish between classes in packages. It's just who is providing the package. So if you export the same package as another module, you are satisfying the reference that some other module might have, whether you actually have the classes or not. So don't try overlapping your classes or your packages across modules. OSGi is not cluster aware. That means a service or a module that you deploy in one node of your cluster is not going to be in all nodes. One node, the service might not start because it has an unresolved reference when it will start on all of the other nodes. They don't talk to each other and say, hey, I have this list of modules. Do you have the same list? Do you have something different? Are all your modules in the same state? So your administrator is very key here in monitoring across your system. And that's all I got. Please rate me well, because my understanding is if I get 5 good ratings, then they might invite me back next year. And if I get 10, Olaf's going to buy me a new car, so that'd be great.